Late modernism, minimalism, 1956 to 1970. We just have been talking about abstract expressionism, and at the end of that discussion, we talked about kind of a foreshadowing of the next movements that were going to be coming up and how they would react to abstract expressionism, generally trying to move away from it, but in unique ways. And we'll see now that the next several movements actually have quite a bit of overlap. And it's always good to remember when we're looking at dates for these different art movements that it's never quite as nice and tidy of a firm deadline or firm date as we would prefer it to be. We always kind of assign it these dates afterwards, but actually at the time these things are kind of ebbing and flowing in a much more organic way. With minimalism, we see minimalism and pop art kind of emerging around the same era coming out of abstract expressionism. So in this lecture, we're just going to talk about minimalism, but it is handy to keep in mind that these two very distinct movements are actually happening simultaneously. Some other terms you might hear associated with minimalism would be ABC art, literalist art, or the term specific objects. And that last one was actually one that the artists themselves coined, especially Donald Judd, would talk about his work as an object, or talking about them as specific objects. So we'll talk about that termage later. Now, minimalist art and the minimalist aesthetic very generally has actually worked its way into quite a lot of our furniture designs, interior designs, and architecture. So we've seen, furniture pieces like this that are very kind of pared down, clean lines, generally more geometric, very kind of reduced, but they come across as very sleek and austere. It might not be the kind of furniture you want to jump on and with a bowl of popcorn to watch your favorite movie, but it is very smooth and sleek and appealing to the eye. So this would be an example of kind of a minimalist aesthetic in general culture. Or here again, or even Apple computers, and even their building there on the left, have quite a minimalist point of view. But when we come to minimalist art, even though we're somewhat used to it in everyday objects and furniture, when we come to minimalist art, a lot of people actually have a bit of trouble understanding it or knowing how to approach it. And it is quite a unique movement in the history of art in its focus. So let's talk about that. Now, if we step back just a moment and look at the work of someone like Clement Greenberg, who's a very influential critic of the time. He was an especially big champion of abstract expressionism and specifically Jackson Pollock. And he saw and said some very important things about how modern art was progressing. He said things like this: I cannot insist enough that modernism has never meant anything like a break with the past. It may mean a devolution, but it also means a continuation. Modernist art develops out of the past without a gap or a break, and wherever it ends up, it will never stop being intelligible in terms of the continuity of art. So, in short, he sees that modern art, including abstract expressionism, is a part of a long history of art, that even though it's changed and gone in new directions, that there is this almost like a hereditary line that continues through it. And so he would say that someone like Michelangelo, someone like Velázquez in the Baroque era, Delacroix in the Romantic era, and Jackson Pollock in the abstract expressionist era, that they all actually have a thread that relates them. He saw this as a pretty linear progression, and a very positive one. So he tended to think that art was going in what you might say is the right direction and in a good direction, and in a singular direction. He also said, really importantly, that each discipline has to prove its own unique and irreducible value, meaning that painting should only do what painting can do, and photography should only do what it can do, and they shouldn't overlap, right? Or sculpture shouldn't overlap with painting or anything else. So what it essentially meant was that painting needed to be abstract and non-representational, because representation was the realm of photography. And to be separate from sculpture, painting needed to be very flat and not try to have an illusion of space or any real texture. So each discipline needs to prove its own unique and irreducible value. to eliminate from the effects of each art any and every effect that might conceivably be borrowed from or by the medium of any other art. Flatness, two-dimensionality, was the only condition painting could share with no other art, and so modernist painting oriented itself to flatness, as it did to nothing else. And I know this might feel a little bit more, it's kind of art theoretical language, so it's part of the interior dialogue that's going on between artists and critics and art connoisseurs. But it's interesting to think about these artists really being very thoughtful and having a theory that's moving them forward about where do they want to go, where should art be going. What's the direction? And so you end up with images like these by Ad Reinhardt, who was working around the same time as the abstract expressionists of that same generation. And he's doing basically what Greenberg had talked about, flatness, reducing the illusion of space, really using just color blocks rather than any sort of representation. And likewise, Frank Stella, a younger generation from the abstract expressionists, and he talks about very intentionally going in a different direction, trying to reduce the sense of the hand of the artist, meaning with Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning of the abstract expressionists, you feel like them, you can imagine them sort of slathering the paint with these big brush strokes. But here, Frank Stella is reducing the artist's hand. It's getting a little more simplified, a little more kind of clean and precise. Lucy Lepard writes about minimalists, and she says something that's funny but interesting. She says, the experience of looking at and perceiving an empty or colorless surface usually progresses through boredom. The spectator might find the work dull, then impossibly dull. Then, surprisingly, he breaks out on the other side of boredom into an arena that can be called contemplation or simple aesthetic enjoyment. Right? So that's the hope of minimalist art, is that it might feel simple or even, what she says, dull at first, but that there is a contemplative nature to it, or a really pure aesthetic enjoyment. Frank Stella very simply put it this way: what you see is what you see. So when you're looking at minimalist art, it's really about those formal characteristics. What is the scale, the size, the color, the material? All of those just very formal aspects are really the heart of minimalism. So let's highlight just some of the artists and some of the work. A very prominent artist would be Donald Judd. Prominent because his work was very well received, but also because he wrote about the movement and about his own work. And so we see with him often the use of reflective surfaces, very simplified forms, and often very geometric forms like these rectangular boxes. And he often uses repetition. But it was important to him that all of the pieces used in this repetition were identical. He wants to eliminate any sense of sort of decorative ornamentation. He wants the forms to be austere and elegant and always very straightforward. From a very influential article he wrote called Specific Objects, he avoids the term minimalism at all, and instead he talks about the new three-dimensional work. And he sees it as an escape from traditional definitions of both painting and sculpture. So a lot of the minimalists felt like painting and sculpture had both kind of reached a dead end. They'd been around so long, basically everything that could be done had already been done. And so he was trying to start from a clean slate, to not add on to the histories of painting or sculpture, but start with something new. And some of the potentials of the new three-dimensional work he noted, he said there's no problem of illusionism in literal space. So it's not trying to be anything that it's not. There's no sense of trying to fool the viewer as with trompe-l'oeil or illusionistic kind of work. He was just wanted it to be very literal, very honest. Actual space is intrinsically more powerful than illusionistic space. So he said, why should we paint the illusion of space when you can create real space? And that's more powerful for an audience member, a viewer, to have a physical relationship to a three-dimensional piece. And then it was also positive in his mind that it was not tied to any European tradition. Again, just wanting that clean slate to start something new and not be kind of tied down to the past. Some of the key terms in tone that are really fascinating to compare, especially with the terms that we noted for abstract expressionism. Here we hear a lot of terms such as objectivity, objects, shape, form, materiality, presence, so the presence of a sculpture, the actual space rather than the illusion of space, unity of parts, relationship of parts, literal. Notice that if you can think back to the key terms that someone like Robert Motherwell used for abstract expressionism, those terms were all much more emotive, much more about finding meaning, truth and authenticity, and these very emotional and philosophical terms. And here with minimalism, it really doesn't get lost in anything that is, even vaguely spiritual or emotive. It's really about the form and what you see and the literal presence of the sculpture. Defining characteristics that he notes, Donald Judd notes, singularity. So he means that the shape, image, color, and surface are single and not partial or scattered. That they use new materials, often industrial and mass-produced materials. So this is a very big change from the past, where mass-produced materials would have usually been seen as a negative. Objectivity of materials. So they want to just present the materials in their raw form. So they wouldn't ever use something like faux marble, but they would use real marble. And they're really choosing the material for its own property. So if a minimalist sculptor is choosing to use wood, or they're choosing to use mud, or they're choosing to use a mirrored surface, it's very specific. It's not just sort of accidental, but they really want to communicate something about that type of material to you. The form of a work and its materials must be closely related. That last point there. And so here is a very well-known work by Judd. Simplified cubic forms, very clean, repetition again. And something I think that is actually, very dynamic about the mirrored surface. I think at first a lot of people might find it off-putting. It might seem unapproachable. However, there's actually a little bit of wit there too, is that he's reflecting, instead of, as with abstract expressionism, you feel like you needed to know something about the biography and the psychology of each individual artist. Here, instead of giving us his life story, Donald Judd is actually flipping the mirror on us. And suddenly we are the subject of the piece and how we are interacting with these boxes. And you can imagine that you would see your own feet scuffle by in this slightly distorted mirrored surface. So it's an interesting switch from the abstract expressionist kind of emotive role into here, where it's much more about the intellect and turning the tables to put the viewer on the platform. When he describes Frank Stella's paintings, it's all formal language. He says, Stella's shaped paintings involve several important characteristics of three-dimensional work. The periphery of a piece and the lines inside correspond. The stripes are nowhere near being discrete parts. The surface is farther from the wall than usual, though it remains parallel to it. So it's just interesting to see this kind of formal critique rather than any kind of emotive or philosophic critique. And some of the minimalist work can get quite large. It does take over a room. It does have that strong presence that they keep talking about, where you really feel it in the room, and it starts to define the space around it. So you could even talk about the positive and negative relationship in these works, where this positive black sculpture by Tony Smith actually shapes and determines the negative space of the room in a very potent, tangible way, or this other large work. And you can imagine, as is the case, that minimalist forms often adapt well for public sculptures. I can, imagine my kids wanting to climb all over this sculpture at an outdoor setting. So there is something actually very approachable about large-scale minimalist work. Minimalist work also reminds us that there's a changing idea of what the artist actually does. So this is Tony Smith's piece called Die, D-I-E, from 1963. And just the image on the right is just to give you a sense of scale. So you can see it's approximately 6 feet tall. What's unique about this piece is that he didn't construct it at all in any way. He never even laid a hand on the piece. Instead, he conceived of it, came up with the concept or the idea for it, and basically ordered it, like had it made at a large industrial site or industrial factory, and then had it shipped to be displayed at a gallery. And so we see the artist moving from someone who has to handcraft every individual object and make the object a rarefied event, to the artist being more responsible for the concept. And the artist may or may not actually physically make the work. Same with these by Donald Judd. He's not actually constructing these concrete slabs and then putting them into these cubic forms. The minimalist work also is conducive to external kind of installations like these. So moving toward a land art that we'll see in a few discussions from now. Carl Andre gives us these kind of metallic tiles upon which you are welcome to walk, or these more simplified wooden sculptures. Again, just letting the material speak for itself, not going to paint over it, not going to cover it up in any way. And Dan Flavin, lastly, whose most kind of signature style is working with fluorescent lights. And these fluorescent lights really do, I mean, of course they change the space around them. The color of them will change your mood, change the sense of the mood and the atmosphere in the room. They also make us very aware of things like the reflection on the floor. Or when you can see them in succession like this, that even though each one is an individual sculpture, they actually all become very related, just as any lights in one room would become related. Or here again, where the reflection on the floor is really dynamic and kind of fun and playful. And again, obviously, he is not manufacturing these lights, but buying the lights and then arranging them in different orders. So one of the biggest changes in terms of our core issues is that of materials. We've gone to industrial materials that are sometimes ready-made, meaning you might be able to go to Home Depot or call them in from a factory, and they're already made there for you, and the artist is just putting them together. And often unaltered. Not always, but very often unaltered materials. In terms of skill and technique, the artist may or may not physically create the work. It might be prefabricated entirely, or it may be parts that are assembled on site. And the artist is foremost responsible for the concept or the idea of the artwork, rather than for the actual making of the work. In terms of changes in expression and in the artist's intent, it's interesting to note that with minimalist art, it's neither a personal expression, it's not about their own biography or emotions, but it's also not directly cultural, because they're not telling us about the politics of the age or social issues. And it reminds us of a term or phrase, art for art's sake. That was first coined in the kind of mid-1800s to describe art that are artists who didn't really want to do literary and narrative and historical themes anymore. They wanted art to be about art. So it really became about the color, it became about the brushstrokes. And here is an example of that with minimalism. It's not about their personal expression or the cultural expression. It's really about this conversation with art. What has art not done before? Where can we go now that they saw sculpture and painting they felt had reached a dead end? So it's really about art moving forward in its own, as it's a discipline in and of itself. In terms of the artist's intent, it's almost a scientific approach to art making. So it's a really big shift from artists of the past who have worked drawing on emotion or drawing on different social themes. As distinct from abstract expressionism, we notice that they are very distant from the trauma of war. So the Ab-X artists were all really responding to World War II, definitely, and even some of them for World War I. With the minimalists, and when we go into the pop artists, we'll see that they are not feeling that trauma as much, that kind of hangover from the catastrophes of the atomic bomb and the carnage of war. And then a change in the image of the artist. So from Jackson Pollock, who was seen as sort of this cowboy, pioneering new techniques and the brooding artist alone in his studio, having an existential crisis. And now we have this idea of, someone like Dan Flavin kind of coolly and calmly assembling his ready-made fluorescent lights. Just a note on this one, look how beautiful that light is behind the piece. So he's got pink and yellow lights facing out toward us as the viewers, but he's got blue and green lights facing backward toward the corner of the wall. So you've got this nice color contrast there. Critique of minimalism. You might be able to guess some of these. The work, some people have complained that the work is too cold or impersonal, it's too unfeeling, which is probably the biggest shift. We have in the past several hundred years been used to much more emotion or spirituality or philosophy in artwork. Has minimalist art become elitist? So people said, well, I don't know how to relate to this, so it seems like it's just, it's made for a very small niche of people, so is it too elitist? Has it stopped being art and just become objects? So is that why we relate well to minimalist furniture, but maybe not as well to minimalist art objects? And has the work ceased being visual art and become instead something more like theater or set design? This was a critique that came from several art critics of the time. So the reaction of the next generation of artists? Well, one reaction is that they want to bring back the humanity or the sense of the artist's hand. So there's a group actually called the post-minimalists who are working right around the same time as the minimalists, but they want to bring some of the humanity back into the minimalist form. So they retain the simplicity of form, use of repetition, etc., interest in materials, etc., but they want to return a sense of the interior emotive life of humanity back into it. And they bring back a subtle sense of the artist's hand. And so we see a few images like these. Robert Morris. It might seem subtle, but this choice from going from a hard material like the metallic surfaces and the bronze and the wood into felt is actually a big change, and also going from rectilinear forms to these more organic forms. So these soft forms feel a little more human. Or these, kind of embracing a bit of chaos, also seems to relate to humanity. Or these forms by Eva Hesse that have a sort of like a humanity in the sense of like a bodily relationship. Or this one by Eva Hesse, which has been described as a three-dimensional Jackson Pollock, and I think you can see the correspondence there. So, turn now to your online journals. A couple additional sources you might check out: the Art Story at theartstory.org. The Museum of Modern Art also has some good information here. And additionally, you could look up on YouTube a clip of Frank Stella talking about his own paintings and why he turned a different direction from the abstract expressionists. All right, thanks so much. Enjoy.